It's a situation that's caused anger and frustration here in Lucas County. Today on 11 Investigates Case Files, Brian Duggar and I are going to be discussing the Lucas County auditor issues over the revaluation.
Yeah, Mel, I've actually been in Toledo since 1998, and we've had a lot of these sexennial valuations and triennials, and I have never seen anything like this as far as anger. And rightfully so, because I mean, property values went up 30% overall. And you know, a lot of people have been reaching out to me and they wanted me to look into this, and I actually did this recently. So we have a package we're gonna look at first. The story.
I wondered at first if it was a mistake.
You gotta be kidding me.
I was rather dumbfounded that it went up $105,000.
The concern is, the increased property value.
For more than 6 months, Auditor Katie Moline has faced the unenviable task of telling Lucas County residents their property values and taxes are going up a lot.
This was a perfect storm where there were a lot of new approved levies that voters approved, that also came on the tax bill. So you're seeing an increase in value, you're seeing new taxes, and so I can see why this moment right now is painful.
In the most recent valuation period, county values went up 29.6%.
What I did was I kept all of these papers.
Paul Young of Monclova has tracked his increases for decades.
Basically, you're looking at about 20% was the highest I ever saw.
Until September, when it was more than 50%.
But how do you go from 197 to 305,000?
Many areas of the county didn't, but suburbs were hit extremely hard.
And it was, around 79,000, They increased it to 136,000.
Higher value, higher taxes for Tom Jameson of Sylvania.
The house and the property went up to like almost $1,300 a half from $700 a half.
More than $100 a month in unexpected expenses.
It's just way out of line, Yeah, I've been retired since 2007.
It was a very divided kitchen originally.
Other increases are even harder to explain.
I had just eaten my dinner and I was full and I was drowsy because I worked, and I started dozing off. And I woke up to a funny smell, like almost a campfire smell.
A fire destroyed Stephen Zawadny's home in 2015. It is part of 5 units in a 1913 row house on North Huron. He rebuilt. His neighbors all left. His home is beautiful. Theirs are gutted. Each increased more than 70% in value.
I would never ever be able to possibly sell my house for the value they raised it to. And I said I would like to invite you to come out here and take a look at it for yourself, and if after looking at it, if you can still justify this increase, then I'll go ahead and pay it.
The county did lower his value. The gutted homes of his vacant neighbors, however, still have 70% increases. His property is not the only fire-damaged home with a big increase in value. 11 Investigates visited several others. A Dearborn Avenue house was raised last week. Its value is up more than 400%. A Brentwood Avenue home, 86%. Pinewood Avenue, 56%. The Miami Street home in which Kimani Latik's body was found, up $5,000 in value. All the properties fire damaged.
With the mass appraisal system, we always want to get it right. And we are committed to getting it right, but there are going to be incidences, like you're describing, where we probably fell short.
Moline's team has a nearly impossible task, 200,000 properties to assess. The mass appraisal system is completed through a third-party vendor who mostly uses home sales, flyovers, visits, but also other factors plugged into a complicated algorithm.
In a mass appraisal, we're really using that higher level pictometry to evaluate the homes. And again, it's that third-party vendor that has the resources, that has those hundreds of staff members to put eyes on these properties, to look at the characteristics that could then go into their property value.
But the Data Cloud Solutions algorithm failed for more than 1,400 properties in September.
There was an error in that formula or in that programming or in that software that our third-party vendor put out that again impacted just these not few properties, but less than 1% of the properties that we evaluate.
Moline has hired a consultant to evaluate how Lucas County determines valuations. Data Cloud Solutions is no longer under contract with the county.
That data error should have never happened, and I want to make it right. And so with that, I thought it's important that there is an independent review of the entire 2024 reevaluation from the beginning to the end, and this data error is part of that.
Now, 11 Investigates has learned Moline proposed a 17.6% countywide increase. The state countered with more than 30%, and she brought it down to 29.6%, which is actually in line with other counties. Montgomery County, which is comparable in size to Lucas County, saw its values go up 37%. In Lucas County, numerous levies have added to taxes, but the 2024 property value increases are like nothing we have seen in the past 2 decades. Only 2 years have seen increases, 2018 and 2021.
The auditor will reissue new values in 2009.
Anita Lopez was auditor from 2006 until 2023.
By 2009, when I'm issuing my first property values, it is the first time since the Great Depression that Ohio auditors lowered property values. So I start my career as auditor dealing with the housing market crashing. So we decreased for the first time in the history of Ohio.
State Representative Josh Williams has asked the state auditor to investigate the numbers generated by Lopez.
And I had multiple people reaching out and confirming for me what some of my suspicions were. And that is the prior auditor artificially suppressed property valuations in Lucas County.
In fact, he says it was for political gain.
Sometimes they would do it just at the behest of a resident who comes in and says, I can't afford my property taxes. And essentially the response from the former auditor would be, well, what can you afford? And then they would lower the property taxes. And, you know, I have accusations that a few weeks later, a volunteer would knock on the door and ask if you would put out a yard sign.
The state auditor confirmed that he's received documents about Lopez, but there's been no announcement of any wrongdoing. And Lopez points to the recession and housing crash as reasons for values being depressed.
Well, unfortunately, politicians are politicians, and sometimes they'll make statements to get attention and not necessarily based on the truth. I think it's well documented, the economy that I was dealing with, the Great Recession plus the pandemic.
Lopez and Moline both believe something needs to be done to fix the property valuation and tax issue.
Individuals who are on a fixed income, who are elderly, who plan for retirement, did everything right. They paid their home off, as you referred to that one gentleman. They sent their children to schools. They paid their property taxation, and now they're being squeezed out of their home by property taxes and the number of levies on the ballot. That needs to stop.
There are good ideas coming forward, but the state has to buy into these. The General Assembly, our state reps, our state senators, and our governor, ultimately have to buy into the importance of changing our property tax system to simplify it, make it easier, and make it so that property owners are not the only ones burdened.
This is a full lot.
And Jameson agrees 100%.
Get these valuations down to normal. This is totally abnormal. People can't live like this.
In full disclosure, most of the people that work here in our newsroom, a good number of them are Lucas County homeowners and have ourselves experienced these valuation huge increases. So we're coming at it too. I mean, inherently, we are property owners here in Lucas County. Megan Hartnett is joining us as she's done many of these stories since September on this issue when people really started to notice, Megan, these huge increases before we even got to the error issue.
Yeah, and that's where those letters went out in the fall, and that's when people started raising concerns, because seeing that your property increases by almost 30%, in some cases higher, some had 50, 60, these huge increases, And that's when there was the informal process. So that's when people could go to the auditor, kind of say, hey, I think there's something wrong. And that's when we started doing stories, but that was before these formal reviews where we currently are.
And back in September, I think that's when the county first started to notice that there were some errors. I think initially they came out and they said there were like 400, then they found another 1,000. So more than 1,400 properties. This algorithm that, Katie Moline talks about, there was something wrong with it.
And that's what, she says in January. She didn't mention it at all in September. She, in September, was saying, there's these huge increases that fall in line with a lot of the other counties in Ohio, that, maybe some of the houses had been undervalued. Maybe people did renovations to their homes or other houses in their area. That's what she pointed to in September. But then in January, she said, actually, when we were doing those, we noticed a few outliers. We started to investigate it. And that's when we noticed that there was these 346 properties that fell into this programming error. And those were only the people who did those informal reviews. And that's when they went and found those other 1,000 people was after.
And the county's actually doing an investigation into that, right? Clemenshaw, I forget his first name, but he's actually looking into it.
John G. Clemenshaw, that's a third-party contractor that the auditor's office has worked with. They created a contract, and they're going to do a complete look at the revaluation process. They're not going to redo it. They're not looking at individual homes. They're just looking at the 2024 process. And that's something Moline said she's doing because of all the issues that came up.
And I think one of the biggest things for people is they just want to know, how did we get to these numbers? What is considered when you say that my house has gone up from $300,000 to $550,000 and I'm not considered in that, I'm not part of that 1,400? So to me, it seems like it's not an exact formula as maybe it should be. I always thought it was, what's your square footage? How many bedrooms? How many bathrooms? What's the general condition of the home? But it seems like many other things are factored in there. Do we have a clear idea of what exactly they're basing those numbers on?
Not really, from what I've ever, learned, because I asked about that, and they said, all of those things are factors that go into it, but then there's the different grade systems that these houses get, and then you have to consider the market, you have to consider just a lot of different factors, and there's no clear, like you said, like equation or formula that it seemed like they were getting for these homes.
Yeah, and what's interesting, Mel, when I think about me personally, and of course you mentioned many of people in the newsroom actually live in Lucas County now, the value of my home went up significantly. I don't know what the percentage was. Then you look at my neighbors, and his didn't go up at all. Mm-hmm. And, his house is a little bit bigger. We share the same amount of property. So I'm just like many Lucas County residents. I'm like, what's going on here?
Exactly.
Why is mine going up and his isn't?
Exactly. The other thing that just my opinion, I think the market that we've been in with home sales, I feel that a lot of people are buying homes based almost on duress. It's not that they would normally pay this amount for this home, but they may be in a situation where I need to buy a home, my family's getting bigger, or I just moved here, whatever the case. And so those home prices, there's a limited inventory, those home prices have skyrocketed, and it feels like people who don't intend to sell their homes are carrying the burden of that market that's going to be somewhat temporary. We ebb and flow with the housing market.
Yeah, and Anita Lopez, when I talked to her, she talked about this very issue. Back when she became auditor, there was, the housing market had collapsed, essentially. I mean, there were a lot of things going wrong.
2008, yep.
And then, of course, the pandemic we went through, and starting in 2020, and now you're having a market where some houses, maybe it's put up for sale at $200,000, but they're getting 5 offers above $200,000, so it's being inflated over what it really should be worth. So whereas it was depressed back in like 2009, 2010, now it's being overinflated, and people are they're getting sticker shock. They're like, what's happening here?
Well, and what's crazy is, I mean, there's reports coming out right now that still Toledo is one of the most affordable housing markets, that we're 200,000 below the national average of home prices. But a lot of the realtors I talked to when I was doing stories about this said that right now the values that they were seeing in the 2024 revaluation were about where Toledo should have been. They said historically they've been undervalued, so people are just shocked when they see that we're catching up to where a city of this size, the resources that are available here, these are what these houses should have been valued at.
Yeah, and Katie Moline, I mean, she talked about, and we have a little clip here about her talking about this really is a perfect storm.
This was a perfect storm where there were a lot of new approved levies that voters approved, that also came on the tax bill. So you're seeing an increase in value, you're seeing new taxes, and so I can see why this moment right now is painful, and why a lot of taxpayers are concerned. And so how do we fix that?
Yeah, and Mel, we had looked at, you can go on the county audit, the Aries site, and you can kind of look at your property and you can see where all your tax dollars are going. And we had kind of looked at it at one point, and it really is shocking when you see how many levies your property taxes are actually going toward. And what we found out, in late 2024, Lucas County, like in Toledo, 7 new levies were voted on at the end of 2024. And for a $100,000 house, that added $530 alone. And so when you go on that Aries site and you see, maybe it's not just one school levy, I mean, you see 3, 4, 5 that are listed. So there's a lot of things you don't even realize. So that is adding to this. When you're seeing the housing values go way up, then you have all these levies on top.
Yeah, and usually when, a municipality or a school district wants a levy, they'll phrase it like, oh, this is just gonna cost you a cup of coffee on a $100,000 home a month or whatever. But what they're not telling you, and you can look up for yourself, as Brian mentioned, if you go to your Aries page and you look under current taxes or levies, you can see that many school districts have multiple levies going back sometimes decades that you're still paying for, but you've just been paying for it. So it's more like 5, 6, 7 cups of coffee plus all of the others, could be zoo or the senior citizens levy or whatever, So it does add up, and you don't really realize how many older ones are still on your roll there.
Yeah, and what's interesting, Mel, it's a really imperfect system because I live in the Anthony Wayne School District, and the levy in late 2024 actually failed, and it caused my property taxes to go up. I mean, schools, it's weird because of the millage, how that all works. So, as property owners, we're kind of caught. We don't know whether to vote for it, whether to vote against it, whether value or taxes are going to go up or down.
That came up, I know in the May 6th election with the Metro Parks levy, a lot of people were concerned because they were seeing these huge increases from the 4 county-wide, levies, plus if there was any schools or other local ones in Lucas County. And then for the Metro Parks to add another levy, a lot of people didn't want to do that and were raising concerns about it.
Well, in these primaries, though, we had a lot that did pass. Most of the school districts I think that we covered did pass, and that's kind of, I think, the success area outside of maybe a presidential election they try to go for, because we've had a lot of failures in the past, too. Let's hear from Katie Moline right now about trying to get this issue fixed and the serious attitude that she takes towards some of these complaints she's been receiving.
With the mass appraisal system, we always want to get it right, and we are committed to getting it right. But there are going to be incidences, like you're describing, where we probably fell short. And so we want to make sure that when we get that to our attention, we fix it. And so right now, luckily we have the Board of Revision process where people can challenge the value.
And I think what has happened here especially is you had this revaluation process and many people fought and lost their appeal or whatever. many of those amounts were high, even if you weren't a part of the 1,400. But then you hear of this error, and the trust has just gone through the basement. You talked with a lot of people who were challenging this. What was your sense of how they were feeling about this?
It kind of goes back to, like we were saying earlier, where a lot of them didn't understand the formula that went into it. And then if they're looking at their neighbors and they're seeing that theirs didn't increase as much, because if you're going to appeal it, you have to put together all the information yourself to bring to the auditor's office, to bring to these revisions and say, this is why I think it should be this. It's not on the state or the auditor's office to prove why they increased it. And that's actually something Josh Williams, who's raising the investigation into Anita Lopez, he wants to propose legislation. Last I spoke with him about this, where the burden is then on the auditor's office or the state to show how they got to that number, because these people are not sure what to do.
And do you think, Megan, most people even know that you can challenge this, or do they accept the number that they receive in the mail?
I mean, again, I am recently living in Lucas County. I'm not a property owner, but a lot of people seem like this is the first time that they're doing it. They've never done it before, or they're not sure
these
where
numbers
to start.
maybe just became too much. To your point, you said you've never seen these numbers like this, and maybe this time they were like, whoa, 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 like something's got to be done here.
Yeah, so Katie Moline, I mean, she's from the very beginning, she's been like, look, if you disagree with us, go to the Board of Revision, file a complaint, then you can go before the board. And a large number actually do get reversed. And I think you actually have some recent numbers on that.
Yes, so so far, the Board of Revision has heard close to 2,000 cases. There's been, let's see, about 1,185 that have resulted in a decreased value, one with an increased value, and 465 with no change.
I've heard that is a risk. If you are actually getting a good deal and you go and fight it, they could come back and say, actually, and I'm talking about they meaning the state, they can come back and say, no, you should be paying more. But I've also noticed, because I've talked to, back when Anita Lopez was the auditor, the sentiment that I got from her was that the state is the one that's pushing the big increase. And I think Brian's piece pointed that out. The local auditor would like to keep it lower. I think that Moline and Lopez fall into that category, but the state is the one that's pushing for that increase.
And Katie said that she went to the state in June with about an 18% increase, and that they kept pushing and saying, no, you have to meet these higher numbers, you have to increase it. And so she came back, and that's where we got to that about 30%.
Yeah, and this was an interesting conversation I had with Anita Lopez, who was an auditor for many years here in Lucas County. And she said, look, I had done this job for a long time. When I got these numbers that the state wanted, then I had my numbers. I had the experience and I had the ability to go to them and say, look, you think this should be up 35%, I think it should only be 17, and this is why. So she had a lot of success. And she actually, when I talked to her, she said, look, Katie's new in this office. I don't want to disparage her experience, because she seemed to be doing a good job to me, but she said she doesn't have the experience with dealing with the state. I mean, they actually get together and they say, these are my numbers, the state says this is what we want, and they kind of fight it out. It's like a little legal thing.
And didn't Katie, and Katie Moline has always been known as, she's very fiscally conservative when she was on city council. She was always the one saying, we can't afford this, what's gonna happen when this money runs out? And I respect her for that. But it seems like they've both done the job in different ways. And didn't Katie say, I follow the rules, right? And so whereas Anita may have been coming at it more of, a back and forth with the state more, is that fair?
Yeah, that's where I pulled some of the things that they previously said, and that's where, Anita Lopez says, I always fought. I always would end up with a number in between. We would always come to an agreement of what was fair. And Katie said, I always just follow the law, and I know that I do everything properly.
And to be fair, doesn't the final number, that's my interpretation as someone who's gone through this a couple of times here in Lucas County, the final number gets signed off on the state. So that's where I'm not really computing if there's an argument that Anita Lopez wasn't following the protocol here. It ultimately, these numbers get signed off on the state, by the state.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's this investigation into Lopez and the numbers that she would bring to the state, but the state did approve them. So I really don't know where how we got to those numbers or how the state approved them.
And I was actually really surprised when I had this interview with Josh Williams. Some of the things that he said about Anita Lopez, I mean, these are serious allegations that, you know, hey.
The signs in the yard, the political signs.
The signs in the yard.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't back off at all. He said, yeah, Anita would, you know, bring down the value, and then a week later, somebody would knock on your door and say, hey, we're going to put a sign in there because, you know, you owe us for doing this. And I think we actually have some sound from Anita when she was talking about this investigation that Josh asked the auditor to do. So let's hear what she had to say.
They have access to all my data, all my records since I've been auditor, and I've had a great working relationship. So unless they're going to go do a whole new audit, which I think, again, would be more politically motivated versus the work they've already done. And I've never had a problem with my valuations ever questioned by State Favor staff. And they've had access to my database multiple times.
Yeah, and to Anita's defense, I mean, she was dealing with this depressed housing market and she was dealing with the pandemic. It's a very different situation than we're seeing right now.
And I talked to you back when you did that story because that sound was from you. I've never seen an auditor or Anita, for that matter, get up in front of a whiteboard and explain in that way. How did you think that she arrived at that sort of presentation?
I mean, that was
just defending herself?
Yeah, it was a one-on-one interview. It wasn't like she was doing that for other people. It was just her and I in the room. And she said, I want to draw you out a timeline to show where things started, what's happened over the course of about the past year, and where things stand. And her biggest point, I think, out of that is that when you look through the timeline, the start of her timeline, the only thing that was different for her is that there's a new auditor. So she's like, this is not anything to do with me. And she showed from her previous experience, I mean, 16 years as an auditor, what she had to have done by those certain dates, what Katie Moline had to do by, you know, June and everything. And her biggest issue was that this programming error had been known about in the fall, or there was some sort of idea that was coming up in the fall, and that it wasn't really disclosed until January.
You know, but I mean, that's like Katie said, that's 1% of people.
And at that point, they didn't know it was a programming error. And Katie Moline said, I didn't want to raise panic. I didn't want to say anything until we knew it was this programming error.
And even that expanded, right? Because at first it was just a few hundred, and then we found out, oh, it's actually 1,400.
Yeah.
In terms of the investigation that Josh Williams wanted, is that happening? And do we have any update on that?
The auditor's office says that they are reviewing documents, they are looking through things, but I don't really know where it stands. I've reached out and I've kind of stopped getting responses from them.
And here's the thing, nobody's gonna go to the state and say, you guys wanted this much and then Anita awarded me way less. They're not gonna do that. They don't want their stuff to go higher.
Yeah. In Clemenshaw, it's part of the investigation. They're looking into those 1,400, how did this happen? But he's also going to discover if something was amiss during Anita Lopez's term, whether that was being artificially deflated and something was wrong there. So he's going to look into that. And I just asked Katie Moline, I said, where do we stand with this investigation? And she said, you know, at this point, he's still going. I don't have any update, no timeline when that might come out.
But again, how do you just investigate Anita Lopez without investigating the state auditor's office? They are the ones who say, this is the number we wanted. Then she says, I want this number. And then they arrive at this number. So how do you investigate her without investigating the whole thing?
They do bring those numbers to the Department of Taxation. So there are two separate state entities involved in this, but the state auditor's office is the one who's doing the review. But our auditor, whether it was Katie or Anita, they bring their numbers to the Department of Taxation, and they're the ones who approve these numbers.
You know, the thing that I'm most hopeful about is it seemed like Katie said that there's going to also, in addition to this, and I don't know, you guys can clarify if it's Clem and Shaw in this or not, there's going to be an overall review of the entire process. And that's aside from what happened here and Anita and the state, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I talked to several residents who had seemingly really unusual increases. And one of them was this very nice man by the name of Stephen Zawadny. And his house had caught on fire back in 2015. I want to watch what he had told me about this.
I would never, ever be able to possibly sell my house for the value they raised it to. And I said, I would like to invite you to come out here and take a look at it for yourself. And if after looking at it, if you can still justify this increase, then I'll go ahead and pay it.
So what's interesting about this story is that his values went up 53%. And he was living in one of Toledo's only row houses. You know, he had his house, he had 4 other houses around him. There was this fire back in 2015. He took the insurance money, rebuilt a beautiful house inside. But his neighbors, they took the insurance money and ran. Like, we don't even know where they are. And those houses are just completely gutted. So you got this guy repaired his house. It looks great. Neighbors all gone, you know, charred, water damage. Nobody would possibly buy those units. And here, the value of his house went up 53%. That doesn't make sense. And I brought to Katie, I mean, we had found a house that had gone up like something like 70 or 80%. It's not even there anymore. It got raised because it had a fire and it got knocked to the ground. She acknowledged, she said, look, there are some that we obviously missed and we need to fix. And this is the problem, is that there are some, the whole system seems to be broken. And it needs to be done better, which I think Katie actually acknowledges because she is new to this job, and I think it needs to be done better.
One of the things that I find interesting is, according to the auditor's office, you'll rarely have someone say, come inside my house and look. I think we as homeowners have all, I mean, I was raised, you never let the auditor in your house, you know, because then he's going to see how nice this or this is, or how many bedrooms, if it's wrong on the you know, areas or whatever. So this is a man who's freely saying, come on in and take a look. And I don't think they usually experience that. I do think most people are known to, you know, not let the auditor in the home. So I thought that was interesting.
No, I definitely talked to some people who said, you know, yes, my value went up, but they didn't know about some of these renovations we did. So we think it's about where ours should be. So we're not gonna complain, or we're not gonna call attention to ourselves, where yet so many other people are like, come look at everything. Like, there is no reason our house should be valued at this.
And there's one other thing I don't completely understand, but Anita talked about, she said she would get the state's values pretty early on, and she would be able to go out to these individual properties, knock on the door, you know, talk to the residents, and then kind of come up with a good idea of what the value of this house should be. She argued that the state actually gave Katie their numbers much later in the process. So she wasn't able to go out, knock on doors, and figure this out. So she believes that Katie was a little hamstrung during this cycle.
And that's something Katie even had told me, is that, you know, she's a year into being auditor. Normally, it's a multi-year process to get ready for these revaluations, especially the 6-year one, it's the big one. And she said, I was here for September, that's 9 months that she was in office. So she said, you know, the thing should have started earlier, and we tried to get everything we could in by those deadlines that they have to meet for the state.
And I like that you pointed out what similar sized cities have done. But do we know if their process is the same? Is it done more like how Anita did it, more how Katie did it, or in a completely different way? And as you know, coming from Florida, we've had a lot of people come work here from different places, and they're like, "What's a mill? What's a what's a levy?" You know, a lot of states do not fund their schools through property taxes or even have property taxes. So I think it's an animal. I'm just very grateful that we're reviewing this process. But even we would sit here in the newsroom and say, why aren't our friends in the newsroom from Perrysburg screaming about this? And you pointed out that they also are a comparable, their numbers went up to a comparable value as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lucas County is not an outlier when it comes to how much the values went up. But they probably are an outlier with how much levy money is being, thrown on people's property taxes. And it's something I had never considered, but yeah, when you look at the number of levies that are going on, and this is a problem, Mel, right? I mean, the way we fund everything off of property taxes, and I don't know, Megan, if you've looked into this too much, but I know there's been a lot of movement in the General Assembly to try to deal with property taxes and kind of bring them down a little bit. Have you followed that at all?
Not too much, but I mean, I will say, just as someone coming from Florida, it is so weird. That's where I didn't understand that the property taxes here are what goes to funding these schools. And it's crazy that it's something voters, have in their hands. And if it fails, these schools aren't getting funding. That just seems like
an
a
interesting
weird
time
setup.
too, because I know your generation, a lot of people feel that they are in a position where they're not going to be able to buy a home. And how off-putting it also is that you see the homeowners going through this, unexpected, huge increase. So I feel for the very young too, who want to get into a first home or who have a young family. And it's just like, am I ever going to be able to afford a home, especially when you go and see what it really costs to own a home? I assume in these other areas, these things are funded through like an income tax or something.
Yeah.
Or a sales tax.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where, it's weird because at first I didn't even fully understand why people were so upset about their property values going up. Because shouldn't you want your property to be valued at a higher amount?
And you said that too.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're like, if property is an investment and you want that investment to go up. So if your investment goes up 20%, that's great, right? But it's not in this case because that's going to take up your property taxes quite a bit. And I talked to a lot of senior citizens, and one of them was Tom Jameson of Sylvania, and we have a little sound from him. He told me this.
And it was, around 79,000, They increased it to 136,000.
Yeah, so that's a huge increase.
On the other side of that, I've had a friend whose house was like 450 and went up over $1 million. So it's happening at both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, and when you think about Tom and some of the other seniors I talked to, these guys, maybe their house has been in a pretty similar range. Their property taxes have been in a similar range. They're living on a fixed income. Now all of a sudden, Tom's property taxes are going up like $100 a month. And when you're living on a fixed budget, this is very difficult and it's not sustainable. This is the 6-year review, but if this keeps going up every 6 years, it's not sustainable for some of these people.
And who else it's going to affect is home builders in Lucas County. I've talked to some of them who say, I'm really hesitant to build there right now. People are not going to want to build homes with me in Lucas County if this keeps, going on. And, similar to people who are on limited income, you pointed out in your story, and I've seen you too, a lot of these newer neighborhoods where they're really, this is what funds the schools. But people plan on a certain amount each month, and then you go and say it's $300,000 more, $400,000 more, you know.
That's scary. I can't imagine as a homeowner, you know, you prepare to pay this much, or, you know, this is how much you budget for, and then there's these huge increases. That has to be hard to deal with. And it's something I can't speak to because I currently don't have to deal with that.
Yeah, and I think that you can see the strain, whether you're from the higher end of the, you know, whether you're making more money and you have bigger house and bigger property tax, or everyone's on a tight budget. You know, if you're living in one of these bigger houses, you probably have multiple kids, or, you know, there's expenses everywhere you look, no matter who you are dealing with this. There's life expenses. And to raise it up like that is a hard ship.
Yeah, and I think everybody agrees at this point. This system seems to be broken. Something needs to be changed. And what I worry about, you know, you didn't see it in this election, you know, this week. I mean, but this was a very low turnout election.
Yeah.
It's probably not a true indicator, but I think going ahead, when you have schools trying to pass levy, the zoos trying to pass levy, you know, the senior centers trying to get more money, when people are dealing with their property taxes going up so much, they're not going to want to vote for these levies. So that's the problem. So that is a problem. I think the system's broken and something's going to have to change.
Well, and it's interesting because the two big school levies were Perrysburg and Bowling Green, so they're Wood County. Their last revaluation was in 2023. They saw a 25% increase, but it wasn't Lucas County. The one in Lucas County was the Metro Parks one, and it was close. And it's something that, you know, you wouldn't think, why
Would be
not? It's
close.
the parks. You know, people here seem to love the parks, but also then there was the threat of sports being cut for those schools, and I wonder if that's why they got such high turnout and such high approval rates.
Yeah. Yep. I think that's about it.
So what's the latest, though? What's next? What are we waiting for on this?
Right now, really, to see if there's anything from the state auditor's office, and then also this review from Clement Shaw, which again will be looking at the 2024 revaluation as a whole, no individual properties, and then through that is also where they can determine if there was any issues with some of those previous revaluations under the former auditor.
Now, so they're just looking at they're not going back to how Anita handled it or anything. They're just strictly looking at this 2024 process.
And through that, though, Clement Shaw has said it is possible to tell if there was an issue in some of those previous ones. So they're not going to be looking directly at them or reviewing them as in depth as they will the 2024, but he said they might have to reference them, or they might have to look back to see how they got to some of these numbers,
Right.
and that could determine.
I am very interested to see this report. I know a lot of people are. When does that come out? Do we know?
No, they said it would take as long as it needs to. You know, roughly 6 months or so was about what we had originally been told, but we don't know.
Yeah. And I think another thing to keep an eye on, the General Assembly, they're debating the budget bill at this point, and there are things in there, I believe, dealing with property taxes, maybe capping them at some point for like seniors, other things. So that needs to be signed by the governor, I believe, by June 30th. So I'm hoping something comes out of that.
All right, more to come. Thanks, Megan. Always love having you here. Thanks for joining us here for 11 Investigates Case Files. We'll see you next time.